Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on an argument that gets thrown around an awful lot with regards to video games, particularly certain video games. And it's not gonna really cover any one particular game, although I will use a few examples here and there, and the gameplay footage you're going to be seeing in the background is what I have been able to play of Deathloop. I say what I've been able to play of it, because not only does it run like absolute garbage on PC, no matter what your hardware is, people even with 3090s and such are getting absolute trash performance out of it, but it's also a rather unstable game that tends to crash a fair bit, so what I've been able to play is basically an hour or two by the time I'm recording this. That said, it is actually relevant to the topic of this particular video, because one of the big things you will see with Deathloop that I've at least been seeing from people who've been enjoying it is just wait until you get through all the tutorials and all that, because it gets way better once you're past all that. That leads me into the actual topic of this video, which is an argument you will see thrown around a lot with video games, and there's a couple of permutations of it. The first permutation is the one that is most commonly used, which is, just wait, it gets good after X hours, and the other one, which is less used, but you will still see it with certain games, and it's even more infuriating, which is, just wait, it gets good after X number of playthroughs. Now, I will be fair to the argument of it gets good after X hours because there is some truth to that, particularly with the kind of argument you see being thrown around with Deathloop, which is the just wait, it gets good after all the tutorials are done. That part at least makes sense. There's always going to be an adjustment period with every single video game, and usually that's going to be the first hour or two depending on what type of game you're playing. Some games it might take a lot longer, particularly strategy games, for example, which tend to be rather complex and will require many hours to really get the hang of. There's also an argument to be made for games with longer and more complex storylines. So, for example, a role-playing game might need the first few hours to really set up the story and all the characters, and also get you used to the mechanics. So, there are certainly some genres where it is understood that it might take you a bit to really get going with it. But for the vast majority of games out there, it shouldn't take more than an hour or two to get you invested in the story, if that's even possible, depending on what kind of story it is, and get you used to the mechanics. If your tutorial or adjustment period for a game that's really not all that mechanically complex goes longer than that, then you are going to risk losing your players at a pretty rapid rate. The longer that period goes, the less people are going to be willing to put up with it. That's not to say that you can't introduce new mechanics and ideas to the player beyond that point, it's just that you should introduce them in small, controlled instances. So, for example, do something like what The Legend of Zelda does, where you have all of the basics down by the time you get out of the first dungeon. But as you continue to explore, you'll gain access to new items, which will open up new methods of exploration, new methods of puzzle solving, and those build on the existing basic mechanics that you've already mastered. Here's the thing, there's a right way to do that and a wrong way to do that. The right way is to gradually introduce these mechanics over time in small controlled instances where you get introduced to the mechanic, you're given an opportunity to explore its use in enough ways to where you get a good idea of how the game is going to be using it going forward, and then it just becomes part of your toolset going forward. Now, ironically enough, the Legend of Zelda series is one of the better examples of this, and also one of the better examples of how this can go wrong. For an example of how it's done well, look at something like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, where you have all of the basic mechanics down by the time you get out of the Deku Tree. That's roughly the first hour or two of the game. By the time you get out of the Deku Tree, you understand all of the basic movement mechanics, you understand the basic ideas behind the puzzle solving, you understand the ranged combat system as well as the melee combat system, and as you continue exploring and going through the dungeons, you will be gradually introduced to new tools in your arsenal, and you'll be able to use them in a more or less controlled environment where they are focusing almost exclusively on that mechanic, so you'll have a good idea of how it works and how it can be used in other dungeons going forward. Ocarina of Time handles that particularly well, which is one of the reasons it's such an enduring classic, even though it's not actually my personal favorite in the series, but that's beside the point. The thing is, while Ocarina of Time did that rather well, the other 3D games in the series really didn't. Majora's Mask seems like it might be doing something like that by introducing you to the Deku Scrub mechanics at the beginning, but that drags on for too long before you're able to just play the game normally, so that ends up being annoying. Wind Waker seems like it's off to a good start by teaching you all the basic mechanics by the time you get off the first island, but then it has an extended stealth sequence with absolute garbage stealth mechanics, so that ends up being pretty frustrating. And then Twilight Princess just drags on for way too long with the basic tutorials, as well as throwing you into wolf form and making you go through that for way too long. And then of course there's Skyward Sword, where this was handled especially poorly by the tutorials basically never ending. The game would constantly give you the basic information about everything, and Fi would never shut up about the most basic information possible, and it ended up just getting incredibly annoying. Thankfully, that's an issue they mostly fixed with Skyward Sword HD, but still, it shouldn't have been an issue in the first place. The thing is, that's an issue more with the structure of the tutorials themselves. In Ocarina of Time, it's handled well and paced well. Majora's Mask and onwards, they just didn't pace things well, and by the time you get to Skyward Sword, they basically treat the player like an absolute idiot who has absolutely no idea what they're doing. That's a separate problem entirely, treating the player like an absolute idiot, but the tutorial period being so long and drawn out is the main problem with that. So problem number one with the just wait until you get out of the tutorials argument is when the tutorials drag on for too long. The longer you drag out that initial tutorial sequence and are just not letting the player enjoy the game, the more frustrating it's going to be. This is also a problem when the pacing of the game is such that you are still constantly introducing basic mechanics throughout a very large portion of the game. Don't worry, we'll come back to that one later, but suffice to say, the dragging out of the tutorial is a bad way of handling this. There are a couple of other bad ways of handling this. The first is simply not having tutorials at all, just assuming you're going to know how to play the game. You're going to see this a lot with older games in particular where they don't really have tutorials because they expected you to read the manuals before you started playing the game. Obviously, the less complicated games with much simpler control schemes are not going to be as much of an issue in that regard. For example, you can go back and play just about any Atari 2600 game and pick it up relatively quickly because you've got a joystick and a single button and that's it. And between that limitation, as well as the basic hardware limitations of the Atari 2600 itself, the games had to be simple and easy to pick up and play. Once you get past that point and you start getting into things like the very tail end of the NES era on into the SNES and Genesis era, and especially once you get into things like the PS1 and N64 era, you're getting more and more games that are complicated enough to need an adjustment period or a basic tutorial of some kind. Now obviously the lack of tutorials is something that you don't really run into all that much anymore, but you do still occasionally run into a game here or there that actually doesn't have a tutorial system of any kind. They'll usually brand themselves as for hardcore audiences, or they'll just be from a studio that just doesn't really know any better. Maybe it's just a couple of dudes who decided to make a video game, and they don't really know anything about game design, so they just throw the thing together. Maybe it's fun, maybe it isn't, but they don't really understand how to teach the mechanics to the player necessarily. Point with that is that not having tutorials at all is a bad way of handling this problem too, and it's something that we thankfully don't run into all that much anymore. The other problem that you'll run into with pacing out a tutorial is front-loading everything. It's more or less the opposite of the tutorial being way too long and drawn out. It's the tutorial is way too short and condensed, so that by the end of it you might have the basic controls down, but you don't really have the understanding of the mechanics needed to really be able to play the game. This is less of an issue if the game is on the simpler side, but once you start getting more complex games where it's just assuming you know how they work, well, you're going to run into some pretty nasty problems there. But it's actually more of a problem for a game like this to introduce new mechanics later on down the line, because you may still not really have figured out the basics, and then it's introducing new stuff on top of the basics you haven't really mastered yet. And thus you have the opposite problem of the tutorial dragging on for too long. If the tutorial drags on for too long, if the adjustment period drags on for too long, you lose the player's interest. If the tutorial period is too short or condensed, and you start introducing new mechanics and such like that, you're going to end up overwhelming the player instead, and they're going to get frustrated. And thus you have the central problem with the just wait until you're out of the tutorials argument. It is a valid argument, but waiting until you're out of the tutorials is going to depend on how extensive those tutorials are and how effective those tutorials are. That's going to be a very delicate balancing act. You don't want the tutorials to go on for too long or the player's going to get bored, but at the same time you don't want the player to be completely overwhelmed by having all the mechanics dumped in their lap and then just being told to figure it out. And unless the game is rather simple mechanically, most developers are not really all that good at handling that. But this is all about just wait until you're out of the tutorials. That's roughly the first hour or two of the game for most games. What about the argument of just wait until you're so many hours in and those hours tend to get further and further out? Well, a lot of that's going to depend on the individual game. For example, if you're playing a strategy game, it makes a lot more sense that it will take a lot more time investment to really be able to get the most out of it. Strategy games, after all, tend to be rather complex, so it will take you quite a bit of time to really be able to understand the mechanics and what you need to do in different situations. The downside to this is that while it is more or less understood that a strategy game is going to take tens of hours to really be able to understand, that also contributes to them being rather niche. It's just one of the fundamental flaws of being a strategy game. If you are making something that is more complex, you are going to have much smaller of an audience that is going to be willing to put up with the game long enough to really be able to understand the complexities of it. And there's only so much that tutorials and introductory sequences can really do for that. But what about games that aren't as mechanically complex, or games where you do have the mechanics more or less figured out within the first couple of hours, and from there on out, it's what the game does with those mechanics as well as what it does with story. Well, that's where you're going to end up with a lot of problems. And you're going to see this problem especially frequently with JRPGs. I have lost count of the number of times I have seen the just wait, it gets good X hours in argument with regards to JRPGs. And the particularly nasty problem that you'll see with JRPGs is that the hour counts tend to be very high in that regard. It's one thing if it's, say, a 30, 40, 50 hour game and somebody is telling you, just wait, it gets good after 4 or 5 hours. Most people are willing to give a game 1 or 2 hours to really get going, but if somebody tells them, just wait, it gets good 4 or 5 hours in, then they might be more willing to wait that amount of time, because you're still dealing with maybe a couple of movies worth of time. And coincidentally, about 5 or 6 hours is the amount of time I will generally give an RPG or even a JRPG to really prove itself to me, to really get things all set up for the story and get things going. The problem with JRPGs in particular, though, is that the hour counts for just wait, it gets good X hours in are usually something absurd like just wait, it gets good 20, 30, 40, even 50 plus hours in. Whenever somebody tells me that, I immediately know that the game is not worth bothering with, because there is absolutely nothing it is doing at 40, 50 plus hours in that it's not doing at 5 or 6 hours in. And if your story takes that long to get interesting, then you have fundamentally failed at writing a story. Hell, this is one of the reasons I've almost written off the JRPG genre entirely. It is precisely because the mechanics themselves are really not all that complicated. You've more or less figured those out within the first 2 to 3 hours of the game. And in the vast, vast majority of JRPGs, the mechanics are nowhere near interesting enough to keep the game going, so it's going to rely almost exclusively on its story and characters. And when your mechanics are actively working against the enjoyment the player might be having, you need that story and those characters to grab the player's interest almost immediately and hold their attention throughout the entire rest of the game. And in my experience, having played a fair few JRPGs over the years, there seems to be almost none that can actually do that. Now obviously if you're going back to some of the earlier games in the genre, like say the original Final Fantasy or the old Dragon Quest games on the NES or Famicom, then obviously you're not going to have as complicated stories, you're not going to have as particularly interesting characters, because they just couldn't really do that on that hardware. As such, a lot of those early JRPGs are very heavy on combat, particularly random encounters, and the combat is ungodly boring. For those of you who might not have much experience with what I would term as traditional JRPG combat, which is the majority of the genre, it can be summed up as follows. Your party stands in a straight line, or maybe a slightly staggered line. Regardless, they're standing in a line. The enemy party is doing the same. And it is a turn-based system, where each party will take turns whacking the other party repeatedly. Maybe they cast a spell, maybe they use an item, maybe they use a special ability that might as well be a spell. Regardless, you are taking turns going back and forth until eventually one party's HP all bottoms out and the other party wins. In the traditional JRPG combat, there's no positioning, there's no strategy to it really, it's just a matter of applying the appropriate debuffs on the enemy and then just whacking them into oblivion. It is so static and so boring that you might think it's just a placeholder, and you might be able to make that argument for some of the earliest JRPGs, but by the time you hit the 90s, they were doing it on purpose. It's just what was expected of a JRPG, to have that extremely static, extremely boring combat. And so they would try to spice things up by throwing in some extensive animations, or once you get to the CD game era, like PlayStation and all that, they would throw in major cinematics for the super powerful attacks that were completely over the top and grandiose. But you're still dealing with a game where your party's standing in a line, the other party is standing in a line, and you're just taking turns whacking each other repeatedly. It is still extremely static and extremely boring, which means that unless the game is really short, or the game is not putting you into combat very often, then you generally are going to be very bored with it very quickly from a mechanical standpoint. That is what you are going up against with a JRPG. This again means that you need that story and the characters to be able to compensate for that. And since JRPGs are so heavy on the combat, you need a really good story and really good characters to be able to overcome that. Like I said, the vast majority of JRPGs out there are not able to do this, because the vast majority of JRPGs out there have extremely slow pacing. You see, that is what people really mean when they are saying that insert JRPG here gets good, say, 20, 30, 40 plus hours in. They're saying that is how long it takes for the story to really get interesting. Because I guarantee you they're not talking about the mechanics. Mechanically, there's nothing a JRPG is doing at, say, 40 hours in that it's not doing at 2 or 3 hours in. The numbers are going to be a whole lot higher, and you might have some really flashy animations with the various attacks you're doing, but you're still doing the same thing you were doing in the first couple of hours of the game. Now, I don't want to turn this video into just a rant about JRPGs, but they do provide the prime example of it gets good X hours in, and how that argument almost never actually holds up, unless the game is just very mechanically complex. But even if the game is very mechanically complex and takes a long time to learn, most people are not going to be willing to put up with the amount of time it takes to really learn those mechanics. And the less complicated those mechanics are, the less time people are going to be willing to put up with the game's crap long enough for it to start, air quotes, getting good. Look at something like Dragon's Dogma, for example, where a lot of its fans will tell you that the game doesn't start to get good until post-game. What does that mean? It means you've finished the entire main story of the game. That is roughly 35 to 50 hours of putting up with the game's very weak writing, its extremely boring and tedious and repetitive combat, and the very long, drawn-out travel times, before you are apparently getting to the stuff that is supposed to be really good about the game. And the funny thing about this is, by the time you get to that point, you're still doing the exact same thing you've been doing those past 35 to 50 hours of gameplay. It's just now the numbers are a lot higher and you're fighting slightly different enemies. You know, there's this quote I heard somewhere that seems especially relevant to this. You may have heard it before. Remind me if you've heard this before. The definition of insanity is doing the exact same thing over and over and over again, expecting things to change. This is one of the bigger problems with the it gets good after X hours argument. You might be able to make that argument if that hour count is a bit more reasonable. If you're talking, say, 5 or 6 hours, maybe even if you're really stretching it up to about 10 hours, especially if it's a longer game. But once you start getting into things like 20, 30, 40 plus hours, you are asking people to do something that is completely unreasonable. You are asking them to put up with a ridiculous amount of boring, tedious, or even irritating garbage to get to something that may or may not be good. You are asking them to do the insane. This is ultimately how I've ended up in the roughly 5 to 6 hours to determine whether or not I should continue playing a particular RPG or JRPG or something along those lines. Because mechanically, I've more or less figured out an RPG or a JRPG within the first 2 to 3 hours, so if those mechanics aren't interesting enough to keep me playing the game for a longer period of time, I'm going to be looking to the story and the characters. If they haven't captured my attention within the first roughly 5 to 6 hours, chances are they're never going to be able to do that, and any point past that is more or less going to be forcing myself to keep playing the game in order to be able to do a video on it. Because any reasonable person by that point would do something like get a refund, or maybe give the game to a friend who might be interested in it, or maybe they would sell it off to somebody if they can't get a refund or something like that. And in case you haven't figured out by now from the fact that I've done things like a 2-hour-long review of Fallout 4 and an hour-long review of The Elder Scrolls Blades, I'm not a reasonable person. There is an awful lot of crap I can put up with in video games, but there is one thing that I cannot put up with, and that is when the game does not respect my time. And that's ultimately what the "it gets good after X hours" argument is going to boil down to. For most games out there that aren't just really complex and just take a long time to learn, saying it gets good after a particularly long amount of hours is just saying that the game doesn't respect the player's time. And while simply being boring is the worst sin a video game can commit, not respecting the player's time is right up there with it. Which of course leads me into the other permutation of the "it gets good after X" argument, which is it gets good after X number of playthroughs. Which is an argument that is only going to work if the game is short. We are talking basically movie length. Because you'll occasionally see this argument with movies as well. It gets good after you've watched it a couple of times. Like, say, Blade Runner, for example. The first time I watched Blade Runner, I actually didn't like it very much, but then I watched it again later, and I actually ended up enjoying it quite a lot, and now it's one of my favorite movies. But here's the thing, a movie like Blade Runner is about 2 hours long. That's about the same amount of time that most people are willing to put into a game before they decide whether or not they want to keep playing it. So if a playthrough of your particular game takes maybe an hour or two, or maybe even less than that, then multiple playthroughs is perfectly fine. Hell, you might actually be able to stretch that out a bit to maybe a 3 or 4 hour game, or at the very high end, a 5-hour game. Once you start going beyond that, it starts to become a lot more unreasonable. To give you a prime example of a game that has been thrown at me as a prime example of this phenomenon of you need to play through this game multiple times for it to really start to get good, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about before I even say it, I guarantee you, because it's kind of hard to avoid this game, considering that I have been constantly lambasted by fans of it ever since I put my video out on it. Doom Eternal. I was constantly seeing responses from fans that I just didn't play the game enough, even though I played all the way through it. I needed to play through the game multiple times, 2, 3, 4 plus times before it would really start to get good, before I would really understand the game. And were the game maybe 2, 3, 4, even 5 hours long, maybe I would have given it a couple of playthroughs. But it is a roughly 12-hour long game. To give you a point of comparison, that is roughly the length of about 4 adventure games. It's the length of a very short RPG. It is the length of 2 or 3 other first-person shooters. And yet, funnily enough, it is the perfect point to end this video on, because it is the perfect encapsulation of everything I have been talking about up to this point. Because the entire game is designed around having every single weapon in your arsenal, as well as every single special ability that the Doomslayer has. And since you don't have all of those things until roughly 2/3 of the way through the game, you're dealing with a massive chunk of the game where you're not able to play it the way it is meant to be played. This is done under the guise of gradually teaching you the mechanics as you play through the game, because you'll be gaining access to the weapons and the special abilities over the course of the game. And every single time you find one, you will get a new tutorial sequence, where the game will interrupt your gameplay to give you a tutorial message telling you what the controls are for it and what it is used for, or in the case of new enemy types, how you can beat them in a more efficient manner, and then you are given an opportunity to try that out. Which theoretically is fine. It's kind of the way The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time introduced new mechanics. Except that roughly 2 hours into The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, you've more or less mastered all of the basic mechanics, and everything else on top of that builds on it. The way Doom Eternal handles things, on the other hand, is a lot more like Skyward Sword than Ocarina of Time. Most of the game is an extended tutorial sequence. It's only in the last couple of levels of the game where you actually have access to all of the weapons and all of the abilities, and you can actually play the game the way it is meant to be played. Because despite what Doom Eternal fans will tell you, they'll say that it has all manner of extensive creativity in it, it's really meant to be played in one very specific way. It has a hard counter system built into the game for a reason. It has extremely low ammo capacity on all of the weapons, even when you're upgraded all the way, for a reason. It is to force you into playing it that one specific way. The problem is, you can't play it that way without all of the weapons and all of the upgrades. And there's no amount of multiple playthroughs that can fix that. It is a linear first-person shooter with a very specific progression built into it. That's not going to magically change when you play through the game again. You can play it on a higher difficulty setting, but if you didn't like the core gameplay loop on a lower difficulty setting, playing it on a higher difficulty setting is not going to change that. So what you're ultimately left with is a roughly 12-hour long game where the first 8 or so hours of it is basically a tutorial for the last 3 or 4 hours. So on your first playthrough, the excuse that the fans are going to be throwing at you is just wait, it gets good after X number of hours, and then by the time you get to the end of the game and you aren't enjoying it, then they'll say, no, you need to play through it multiple times, because it just gets good after multiple playthroughs. Somehow. Magically. Here's the simple fact of the matter. If someone is telling you that a game gets good after multiple playthroughs, it either has to be a really short game, like I said, movie length, or maybe even shorter than that, or it has to radically change after the first playthrough. Maybe you finish the game and it suddenly unlocks a massive set of new abilities or something like that, and then maybe it'll get more interesting. But here's the very simple question that I have for anyone who thinks this is a remotely acceptable way of designing a game. Why can't it be good the first time through? Why does it take multiple playthroughs to start getting good? If your answer to that is, well, after you finish the game, you have access to all of the equipment and all of the abilities and such, and you can go back and replay the previous levels with all those abilities the way the game is meant to be played, well, you're basically admitting a massive fundamental flaw with the game's design. If it can't be played the way it's meant to be played until the very end of the game, or even after you've finished the game, then there's really no point in bothering with it. If, on the other hand, your response to, well, it gets good after multiple playthroughs is, you notice a lot more of the subtleties, or you notice a lot of things that you might have missed on your first playthrough, which is more of a thing you'll see with things like adventure games or role-playing games, then you might have a bit more of an argument there. But even then, that's probably still only going to apply to a game that is very short, maybe 2 or 3 hours long at most. But if a game is, say, 10 plus hours long and they didn't enjoy it the first time through, chances are they're not going to replay it. That's certainly how I am with Doom Eternal. A lot of people were like, oh no, you need to play through it multiple times before it starts to get good, before you'll really understand the mechanics. When the problem wasn't that I didn't understand the mechanics. I understood the mechanics just fine. It's just that those mechanics weren't any fun. I wasn't enjoying the core gameplay loop. It wasn't a matter of exploring more of the lore. It wasn't a matter of going into the Slayer Gates and playing these very specific challenges. It wasn't a matter of whether the game was difficult or not. It was that the core gameplay loop is an annoying, obnoxious, tedious, utterly exhausting slog, and no amount of replaying the game was going to change that. And thus we come to the real problem with the it gets good after X playthroughs argument. It's only going to apply in 2 instances. The first instance is if you kind of enjoyed the first playthrough, but you felt like there was more that could have been there, and somebody comes along and says, hey, there were all these things you might have missed. If you go back and replay them, you might have a better time. But even then, you're still already kind of enjoying the game the first time through. The second case is if the game is just really short, And even if you do take the time to replay it and end up not really liking it, it's not that much of a time loss. And if it's a game that gets good after the first playthrough because it unlocks new stuff that wasn't available in the first place, then it just becomes a matter of, well, that stuff that was available after you've played through the game already should have just been in the first playthrough to begin with, so you could actually enjoy it the first time through. Because the desire to replay a game mostly comes from enjoying the game in the first place. And if you've enjoyed it in the first place and you play through it again and you notice new things, that's great. If you've played through the game already, you didn't enjoy it the first time through, and somebody comes along and says, no, you gotta play through it again, it gets good. It is not only a perfectly reasonable response to say, no thanks, it's probably the best choice, because you're probably not going to have a better time the second time you play through, especially if the problems you were having with the game are fundamental to its design. And all that more or less covers what I wanted to talk about with this particular topic. If there's anything you want me to clarify, go ahead and bring it up in the comments and I'll try to respond to it there. But suffice to say, I put almost no stock in the it gets good after X number of hours argument, unless they're just saying, look, you have to get through all the tutorial sequences and get out of the game's introductory sequence in order for it to really start getting good. That is a reasonable request, although that introductory sequence better be on the shorter side. But if somebody comes along and tells you something like, oh, this game gets good after 40 hours, or this, I don't know, TV series gets good after 50 episodes, then what was the point of the preceding 40 hours and the preceding 50 episodes or whatever? Why do we need to go through all that garbage in order to get to something that might be good? I mean, at least with a TV series, you can skip the episodes that you don't want to watch. If it's a game, you can't just skip the first 40 hours. Unless it's a really weird game. I can't think of any that would let you do that. But what you can do for a game that's not good for the first 40 hours or so is just not play it. There's plenty of other games out there, many of which you will probably enjoy instead. So maybe just go play those instead of playing something for 40 or so hours because somebody told you it gets good after 40 hours, only for you to realize at the point that the game is supposed to get good, it really wasn't worth all that time and effort that you put in. That really wasn't enjoyable. Thanks for watching.